Picture this. You are standing inside the sprawling labyrinth of Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, sometime in the mid-17th century. The Bosphorus breeze rattles the latticed windows, carrying with it the smell of salt water, roasted spices from the city, and the faint, cloying perfume of rose oil. The palace is silent in places where no silence should exist. Corridors lined with gilded tiles, their patterns dizzying, their surfaces cold. Behind these carved wooden doors lies the most infamous institution of the Ottoman world, the imperial harem. Before diving into these forgotten stories of power, blood, and desire, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. It's remarkable that across centuries and continents, we gather here to stare into the darkest corners of history together. The harem was not simply a collection of women. It was a political machine, a breeding ground, and a prison, all at once. At its peak, it held hundreds of concubines from every corner of the empire, Christian captives taken in raids, Slavic maidens purchased from Crimean slave markets, Venetian women captured by corsairs, and Circassian beauties trafficked for their pale skin. Once inside, escape was almost impossible. The walls were high, the eunuchs watchful, the rules merciless. For those selected to serve the Sultan, the body became both sacred vessel and disposable object, stripped of individual will, refashioned into a currency of power. The accounts of travelers and envoys like Ogier Ghiselin de Busbecq, the Habsburg ambassador, give us fragmented glimpses. He describes the harem as a gilded cage where pleasure was engineered, where girls were trained in music, dance, and submission, and where a single night with the Sultan could mean either elevation to unthinkable power or silent disappearance. In the Ottoman imagination, the Sultan was the shadow of God on earth. His virility, his ability to produce heirs, was not private, it was a matter of empire. A barren harem was an omen of cosmic imbalance. But beneath the silks and perfumed baths, there was rot. The eunuchs, castrated men torn from their own cultures in Africa or the Balkans, patrolled the halls as both guardians and prisoners, stripped of sexuality, their mutilation both a mark of purity and a grotesque violence. In the marble bathing chambers, bodies were washed and perfumed, their skin polished to a sheen, their every movement rehearsed for a master who might never look them in the eye. The sacred had collapsed into the profane. The body was no longer flesh and soul, it was a tool, a weapon, a sacrifice offered at the altar of dynastic survival. The women knew it well. Roxolana, also known as Hurrem Sultan, once a Ruthenian slave, clawed her way to the pinnacle of power in the 16th century. Chroniclers whisper that she bewitched Suleiman the Magnificent, breaking centuries of custom by becoming his legal wife. In her rise, rivals vanished mysteriously. Some say concubines drowned quietly in the Bosphorus, their bodies slipping beneath the surface at dawn, weighted with stones. Others whisper of silken cords pulled tight around throats, a form of execution as elegant as it was merciless. The harem was a place where jealousy killed, where beauty was weaponized, and where the Sultan's favor was both salvation and damnation. The anthropologist might call it a system of controlled pollution. The Sultan's body was imagined as pure, divine. To touch him, to receive him, was to absorb a fragment of that sacred power. But the same act reduced the woman to filth once she was discarded. Purity and pollution were not opposites, they were sequential states, imposed by political need. The sacred act of union was inseparable from the profane act of disposal. Each concubine lived suspended on that knife's edge. And then came Ibrahim, remembered by history as Ibrahim the Mad. His reign in the 1,640 seconds dragged the harem into its most grotesque chapter. Obsessed with the flesh, he demanded women in terrifying numbers, some chronicles saying over 200 concubines at a time. He lined entire rooms with fur, ordering his harem to crawl on hands and knees as animals, while he roared with laughter. His mania was not secret. European envoys described it with a mixture of horror and fascination, seeing in him the collapse of reason under the weight of absolute power. It was Ibrahim who, in a fit of paranoid fury, ordered nearly 300 of his concubines drowned in the Bosphorus, accusing them of betrayal. Eyewitnesses recorded the bodies washing ashore for days, pale limbs tangled in seaweed, jeweled anklets glinting in the sun, the perfume of the palace replaced by the stench of salt water and decay. The harem's purpose to produce heirs, to stabilize dynastic succession, had turned cannibalistic, devouring the very women it depended on. These acts were not random madness. They were part of the larger machinery of control. The harem functioned as both sacred space and slaughterhouse, where the sultan's virility was sacred, yet women's lives were expendable. The tension between sacred and profane, purity and filth, was never abstract. It was written into their bodies, enforced by cords, water, and silence. And as the empire watched, the harem became a mirror of Ottoman decline. Chroniclers in Istanbul whispered that when the sultan's pleasures grew grotesque, when the harem's rituals of desire tipped into rituals of horror, the empire itself began to rot from within. The eunuchs, once guardians of purity, became power brokers. The mothers of princes became kingmakers. Blood and desire wove themselves into politics, and the fate of an empire was decided in perfumed chambers where screams were muffled by silk. The story does not end here. It deepens, descending into the secret practices that both enthralled and repelled contemporaries. It is in these hidden rituals where pleasure, violence, and politics fused that the horror of the Ottoman harem reveals its truest face. The corridors of Topkapi at night were a theatre of whispers. The lanterns of eunuchs flickered across tile mosaics, and the women, their faces painted, their bodies draped in gauze, thin silks, were summoned not as individuals but as instruments. Every movement was orchestrated for the sultan's gaze, a performance where a slip, a refusal, or even an ill-timed glance could end in disappearance. Ibrahim's obsessions set the tone. Chroniclers record him demanding women with the most specific features: enormous size, hair of impossible length, skin perfumed with ambergris. He once elevated a concubine of great bulk, called by Europeans the she-elephant, to a position of honor, parading her through the palace as if she were a prize beast. The women understood then that survival did not depend on beauty alone. It depended on embodying the sultan's fantasies, however grotesque. But fantasy was never safe. A favorite today could be drowned tomorrow. The drowning itself was ritualized, performed in silence by deaf-mute executioners. They entered the women's chambers at night, carrying the bowstring or the silken cord. No words were spoken. To shout would have been to defile the purity of the act. Instead, the women were seized, their cries smothered, their bodies dragged through hidden passages to the Bosphorus. The cords were looped around their necks with the precision of priests performing a rite. The splash of bodies into the water at dawn was the only sound that testified to their fate. European envoys, horrified yet fascinated, recorded these stories with cold detail. The Venetian bailo described how the palace walls seemed to consume women, their names never spoken again, their existence erased but for the faint perfume left on the pillows. For the Ottomans, this was not murder in the sense we understand it. It was maintenance of order, purification of a system in which the sultan's body was divine, and any threat to his pleasure, or even suspicion of betrayal, was pollution. Ottoman Sultan understood this machinery better than anyone. Born Anastasia, a Greek girl taken as tribute, she rose from concubine to the most powerful woman in the empire. As Valide Sultan, mother of the reigning sultan, she wielded power over the empire's survival. Chroniclers say she controlled appointments, manipulated alliances, and even orchestrated executions within the harem itself. Kosem's genius was not seduction, it was calculation. She transformed the harem from a private pleasure chamber into a political council, but her power was written in the blood of her rivals. To maintain her grip, she ordered concubines strangled, princes smothered, and potential threats erased. For her, the silken cord was not just an executioner's tool, it was a political instrument, binding the empire together with terror. Yet even she could not escape the logic of the harem. In 1651, her grandson Mehmed IV's mother, Turhan Sultan, turned on her. One night, executioners entered Kosem's chamber. She fought, clutching at the curtains, screaming as the bowstring cut into her throat. Chroniclers say the struggle lasted for minutes, her nails tearing at the cords, until silence fell. The most powerful woman in the empire died, the same way as countless concubines she had condemned by ritual strangulation, her body left limp in the perfumed dark. The anthropologist would note here the collapse of sacred and profane. The sultan was imagined as God's shadow, the harem as sacred garden, and yet what took place inside was a theatre of filth, of excess, of decay. The sacred act of reproduction, ensuring heirs for the empire, was fused with acts of cruelty that reduced women to objects of disposal. Purity was never inherent. It was imposed, stripped, and reapplied like paint, depending on whether a body served or threatened imperial order. For Ibrahim, desire was inseparable from paranoia. The more he indulged, the more he feared betrayal. He filled his chambers with furs, ordered women to act as animals, and demanded acts that blurred the line between ritual play and dehumanization. European chroniclers describe him releasing live fish into the pools of the palace baths and forcing women to catch them with their mouths. These humiliations were not aberrations, they were logical extremes of a system where the sultan's will defined reality. And when his paranoia reached its climax, the harem itself was purged. Nearly 300 concubines drowned in the Bosphorus in one night. The eunuchs carried out the order without hesitation, binding wrists, gagging mouths, and pushing bodies into the black water. The waves carried the bodies to the shores, where fishermen found them tangled together, their jeweled anklets glittering in the morning sun. The stench of decay spread across the city, an unspeakable reminder of the palace's hidden rites. The empire, already strained, took this as an omen. In coffeehouses and mosques, men whispered that when the sultan turned his harem into a graveyard, Allah had turned his face away from the Ottomans. Chroniclers saw in the women's corpses a metaphor for imperial decline, the sultan's power over flesh mirrored by his empire's rotting core. In this dark machinery, the body was never just flesh. It was a canvas for divine authority, a battlefield of purity and pollution, a currency of survival and annihilation. The women who lived in the harem were not wives or lovers in the sense we understand. They were sacrifices in a theatre of power, their beauty consumed like incense, their deaths concealed like shameful secrets. And yet, in this silence, power also gestated. The Valide sultans Roxolana, Kozum, Turan, used the same system that devoured their sisters to rule empires from behind curtains. They understood that the sacred was built on the profane, that the sultan's divinity was hollow without their manipulation. But their triumphs, too, ended with cords and blood. The harem, then, was not merely a place of desire. It was a factory of horror, a crucible where body and soul were burned for dynastic survival. Its rituals were not forgotten accidents of madness. They were the logical, brutal expression of an empire where the sacred was inseparable from violence. The black-robed eunuchs who patrolled the harem were themselves monuments of violence. They were taken as boys, often from the Sudan or the Balkans, marched in chains across deserts or shipped through the Mediterranean, and subjected to a mutilation that was at once physical and symbolic. Castration, performed crudely in remote slave markets, was intended to sever them forever from the world of desire. Those who survived the agony and infection, a small fraction, were delivered to the palace as guardians. Their bodies bore the empire's most grotesque contradiction. They were mutilated in the name of purity, yet tasked with overseeing a system built entirely on sex. Within the harem, these eunuchs were feared as much as pitied. Their black robes whispered across the tiles, their faces unreadable. They carried out the sultan's commands without hesitation. When a concubine was to vanish, it was the eunuchs who dragged her away. When a new girl arrived, frightened and foreign, it was the eunuchs who stripped, bathed, and inspected her. Chroniclers from Venice and Vienna, forbidden to enter, pieced together these rituals from rumors and from the testimony of slaves who somehow escaped. What they revealed was a theatre of dehumanization. The eunuchs themselves occupied an ambiguous place. Deprived of family and children, they forged bonds of loyalty to the palace, but also cultivated hidden networks of influence. The chief black eunuch, the Kuzla Asa, held a power second only to the sultan's mother. He controlled access to the sultan, managed the harem's treasury, and even influenced imperial appointments. Here, again, we see the collapse of purity and corruption. Men mutilated to embody chastity became some of the most feared political figures in the empire. Anthropologists describe this as the logic of pollution as control. The eunuchs' mutilated bodies marked them as permanently impure, yet it was precisely this impurity that allowed them to regulate the sultan's supposed purity. They were both the guardians of the sacred and living reminders of filth. The harem's order depended on this paradox, just as the empire's order depended on violence masked as ritual. The women lived within this paradox too. Life in the harem was structured like a ladder, with stages of initiation that resembled both convent and prison. The youngest were asamis, trainees, learning music, poetry, etiquette, and the arts of seduction. Their bodies were constantly watched, evaluated, and disciplined. A handful advanced to become gozde, the favorites, permitted to share the sultan's bed. Fewer still became iqbal, fortunate ones who bore children. The highest step was Haseki Sultan, a royal consort elevated above the rest, but even here, security was never guaranteed. A rival's whisper, a eunuch's report, a shift in the sultan's desire, and even the most favored woman could meet the silken cord. Historical records show us how quickly favor turned to death. In the reign of Suleiman, Hurrem Sultan's rise coincided with the disappearance of her rivals. Venetian envoys wrote that women once adored by the sultan were never seen again, and the court whispered that their bodies were delivered to the sea. In the 17th century, Sultan Murad IV, notorious for his cruelty, reportedly executed concubines merely for gossiping. But the horror was not only in sudden death, it was also in the slow erasure of self. A concubine's name was often changed upon entering the harem, replaced with something exotic or ornamental names like emerald, jewel, or rose. Her native tongue was beaten out of her. Her memories of home became dangerous, reminders of a self that no longer existed. In this sense, the harem was not simply a prison of stone, it was a prison of identity. And yet, from this machinery of erasure, power could emerge. Kosum Sultan maneuvered through it to dominate politics for decades. Turhan Sultan, once a slave herself, orchestrated her mother-in-law's death to secure her own survival. These women wielded absolute authority over life and death within the palace, shaping imperial policy with whispers from behind latticed screens. But such triumphs always ended in the same theatre of horror. In 1656, when political factions turned against her, Turhan Sultan nearly suffered the same fate she had ordered for Kosum. Chroniclers tell us that executioners entered her chamber at night, cords in hand. She screamed so loudly that guards rushed in, and she was spared only because of their intervention. The silken cord hovered over every life in the harem, from the lowest concubine to the most powerful queen mother. Here, the anthropological paradox sharpens. The harem was built to ensure dynastic continuity, to guarantee heirs. Yet it regularly destroyed the very women needed to produce those heirs. Sexuality was sacralized as the source of life, but weaponized as the justification for death. The body of the concubine was a resource to be cultivated, consumed, and discarded. Her intimacy with the sultan, imagined as sacred union, could at any moment be reclassified as profane corruption. European visitors, though barred from entering, sensed the horror through the empire's politics. They wrote of the Sultanate of Women, a period when mothers and consorts dominated imperial policy. To outsiders, it was evidence of decadence, of decline, of a court drowned in sensuality. But inside, it was evidence of survival. The women had learned to wield the only power allowed to them, power over the sultan's body. And when the sultan's body faltered, so did the empire. Ibrahim the Mahdi's excesses, Murad IV's cruelties, and Mehmed IV's dependence on his mother all fed the narrative of decline. Historians saw in the horrors of the harem a mirror of a state corroded by desire, paranoia, and blood. The screams that echoed behind the latticework were, to many, the echoes of an empire devouring itself. But the story descends still further, into the darkest rituals of control where concubines were subjected to tests of loyalty, where eunuchs carried out humiliations disguised as purification, and where the line between sacred union and sacrificial death vanished entirely. The rituals of the harem were designed to blur the line between devotion and degradation. Every concubine, upon entering the palace, was subjected to what the eunuchs called purification. Their bodies were shaved, scrubbed with pumice until the skin bled, and drenched in rose oil until the stench of travel and memory was erased. The act was not simply cleansing, it was annihilation. The girl who entered the palace ceased to exist. What remained was a body prepared for consumption, stripped of history, family, and name. Those who advanced were subjected to constant tests. Chroniclers describe how the favorites were paraded before the sultan-like offerings. They danced, not with freedom but with choreographed precision, their movements rehearsed to the point of exhaustion. At times, the sultan ordered mock feasts where the women were forced to eat in silence while he watched, studying them as a farmer might examine livestock. He gauged not only beauty, but obedience, restraint, and submission. Any slip a word, a laugh, a gesture could end a life. Punishment for failure was theatrical. A woman accused of betrayal might be stripped naked, paraded before her rivals, and then handed over to the mute executioners. Others were forced into humiliations that blurred cruelty with sacrilege. European envoys wrote in hushed tones of women made to crawl like animals, bark like dogs, or submit to inspections meant to prove their chastity. The rituals reinforced the central logic. The sultan was divine, and the women were vessels. A vessel that leaked, cracked, or resisted had to be broken. Death itself became a ritual performance. The silken cord, soft and elegant, was chosen deliberately. Steel was forbidden in the harem, it spilled blood, and blood was polluting. Strangulation left the skin unbroken, the body intact, as if the woman had simply vanished into sleep. In this way, the execution disguised violence as purity. The corpse could be wrapped in silk, perfumed with musk, and disposed of without staining the palace. But everyone inside knew the truth. Beneath the fragrance, the cord left bruises like dark necklaces, silent signatures of power. The Bosphorus became the final graveyard for countless women. Fishermen along the shore of Scutari spoke of finding bodies at dawn, tangled in reeds, their hair drifting like seaweed. Some still wore jeweled anklets or fragments of silk. The chroniclers called it the procession of the drowned, a macabre tide that washed the secrets of Topkapi into the open. Yet no one dared speak too loudly. To accuse the sultan was to court death. So the bodies were buried quickly, the water washed clean, and the rituals resumed. Inside the palace, fear was constant, but so was ambition. Women formed alliances, whispering in the baths, bribing eunuchs for information, plotting against rivals. The harem was as much a court of politics as the divan itself. A single rumor of witchcraft, infidelity, or defiance could eliminate a rival. And so the women participated in the system that consumed them, sharpening the cords that might one day be wrapped around their own throats. The anthropological paradox is stark. The harem was imagined as the womb of the empire, the sacred chamber where dynastic life was created. Yet its practices resembled not fertility but sacrifice. The sultan was the godlike figure, the women his offerings. Each death reaffirmed his dominion. Each humiliation reinforced the sacred divide between ruler and subject, purity and pollution. The harem was both temple and slaughterhouse. One chronicler, the English traveller Sir Paul Ricoeur, wrote with a mixture of fascination and disgust. He described the sultan as a man cloistered among his women, feared and adored like a god, while in truth he is their prisoner as much as their master. Ricoeur glimpsed the central horror. The sultan's divinity was propped up by a theatre of suffering that corrupted both ruler and ruled. The women lost their identities, the sultan lost his humanity, and the empire bore the cost. Ibrahim the Mad's purges weakened the dynasty. His obsession with pleasure drained the treasury. His paranoia alienated allies. His massacres of concubines left the palace haunted, the harem a charnel house masked in perfume. Even as the empire stretched from Hungary to Arabia, its core was corroding. Power, corrupted by desire, consumed itself from within. The harem's darkest rituals did not disappear with Ibrahim. They lingered, resurfacing in whispers throughout the 17th century. Princes were still strangled in their cradles to prevent succession disputes. Concubines still drowned in the Bosphorus. Eunuchs still ruled through mutilation. The system staggered forward, its beauty masking rot, its silk soaked in fear. The horror of the harem was not in one sultan's madness, nor in one woman's ambition. It was structural, embedded in the very logic of empire. The sacred union of body and dynasty demanded sacrifice, and sacrifice demanded victims. The concubines, the eunuchs, even the sultans themselves, all were trapped in this machinery. And so, as the centuries passed, the empire's decline became entwined with the echoes of these rituals. The drowning pools, the strangled throats, the mutilated guardians, All were omens of a system that had devoured itself in its attempt to control life, death, and desire. The screams are gone now. The palace halls are silent, filled with tourists and guides. But if you stand at the edge of the Bosphorus at dawn, you may still imagine the tide bringing in what the palace cast out. Silk tangled in seaweed, anklets glinting like broken stars, faces pale beneath the water. The empire is gone, but its rituals of horror still linger, whispering through the stones of Topkapi. By the late 17th century, the echoes of the harem's cruelty had already woven themselves into the empire's bloodstream. Every execution, every silken strangulation, every corpse dumped into the Bosphorus left more than a corpse, it left a mark on the collective imagination of Istanbul. Merchants whispered of the palace as both heart and tumor, the place where the empire's future was decided in whispers behind latticework, and where the womb of dynastic life reeked of perfume masking rot. The political consequences were catastrophic. When succession hinged on the whims of concubines and the survival of infants hidden in gilded cages, stability dissolved. Sultan after sultan rose to the throne as a boy, manipulated by the Valide Sultan, his mother, or by eunuchs who had perfected the art of power from the shadows. For every heir who survived, there were brothers strangled in infancy, uncles left to rot in the cafes, the gilded cage, until madness consumed them. Chroniclers in Europe marveled not only at the cruelty but at the short-sightedness. An empire that conquered cities with cannon reduced its greatest dynasty to whispers, poisons, and silken cords. The anthropological truth was stark. The harem had been imagined as the sacred center of empire, a womb that guaranteed continuity, but it functioned instead as a theater of sacrifice, where women, eunuchs, and princes alike were consumed to preserve the illusion of order. Purity and pollution became the currency of politics. A woman who bore the sultan a son was pure, exalted, untouchable until a rival whispered treachery, at which point she became pollution to be erased. A eunuch, mutilated to symbolize chastity, became a broker of secrets, a figure of contamination whose hands nonetheless held the empire's keys. The system devoured itself because it had been designed not for stability but for fear. Eyewitnesses recorded how the empire's outer face began to mirror its inner corruption. Venetian envoys in the 17th century wrote of a city that seemed exhausted, its markets rich, but its politics rotten, its armies vast, but its spirit weakened. The power once projected from Topkapi now seemed eaten away by its own shadows. Each purge of the harem mirrored purges in the army, in the bureaucracy, in the empire's provinces. The harem was no anomaly, it was a microcosm. The horror was not only in the palace. Its rituals spilled into the wider culture. The drowning of women in the Bosphorus became such a familiar practice that Istanbul's fishermen knew to look for bodies at dawn. Children in the markets whispered of the ladies of the water. The eunuch's authority outside the palace grew so great that even judges and viziers feared them. The sacred had become inseparable from the grotesque. The sultan's body, a divine symbol and a corrupted machine. As centuries passed, the empire limped forward, but the memory of the harem's rituals lingered. Historians of the 19th century, both Ottoman and European, looked back on the 17th with disgust, labeling it a time of decadence, decline, and corruption. They saw in the drowned concubines and strangled princes the seeds of imperial collapse. And though the empire survived until the 20th century, its legitimacy was forever shadowed by the image of rulers whose power had been corrupted by the very pleasures meant to guarantee their strength. The horror here is not simply historical, it is anthropological. The Ottoman harem reveals the danger of a system where bodies are treated as resources, purity as a weapon, and desire as a tool of governance. It shows how sacred ideals, dynastic continuity, divine order, imperial power can be built on profane acts of cruelty and disposal. It shows how an empire can rot from within when its core rituals are structured on fear and blood. And it leaves us with a warning. The palace is now a museum. Tourists walk through its gilded chambers, admire its mosaics, and marvel at its jewels. But the air still carries something else. If you listen closely, beyond the chatter of guides and the clicking of cameras, you may still hear the muffled echo of strangled breath, the rush of bodies sliding into the Bosphorus, the whisper of silken cords tightening in the dark. History tells us that civilizations do not collapse from external enemies alone. They collapse when their rituals, their inner logics, consume them. The Ottoman harem was not a curiosity of the past, it was a mirror held up to human power itself. Wherever bodies are turned into tools, wherever purity is enforced through violence, wherever the sacred masks the profane, the same machinery begins to hum. It may not end with silk cords and drowned concubines, but it ends the same way, with corruption, decay, and silence. The empire of the sultans is gone, but the questions remain. What happens when desire becomes governance? When purity is defined by power and pollution is whatever threatens it? When humans are reduced to instruments of dynastic survival, the Ottoman harem offers an answer, written in perfume and blood, in drowned bodies and gilded cages. It whispers across centuries that the greatest horrors are not accidents. They are systems, rituals, and beliefs so deeply embedded that those who live within them mistake horror for order. And so, as we walk through the ruins, as we peer into the chambers where women once dreamed and died, we should remember, history is not silent. Its whispers remain. They tell us that behind every gilded lattice there may be a cord, behind every sacred promise a body waiting to be discarded, and behind every empire, no matter how powerful, the machinery of horror grinding slowly toward collapse.